Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is our upcoming Jewish holiday. Let's talk about Purim, the diaspora Jewish holiday. Let's think about it, and it will become obvious that the Purim story is the quintessential diaspora Jewish experience with a fairy tale ending. The book of Esther, Megillat Esther, is the only book in the entire Bible that is staged entirely outside of Israel. It's not a theological work. The names of the Jewish heroes and evil Persian villains in the story are not Hebrew names at all. They're actually Persian names. But now they've been integrated into the Jewish lexicon of names. And the name God, in any form, is never mentioned in the book of Esther. Jews are being persecuted. There's a plot to massacre all the Jews throughout the land, in all of its 127 provinces. And at the last minute, the Jews are saved. Not only are they saved, and here is the fairy tale and where it takes place and takes an added dimension. The Jews of Persia kill their plotters, and thousands upon thousands of those who joined in the murder plot. The Jews even get a second day to seek out the plotters and murder them. For good measure, the worst of the lot are killed twice, and even hung from the tallest tree. And in between it all, there are two lavish feasts. The Purim story is an example par excellence of the joke that is told at some point during almost every Jewish holiday. What 11 words do Jews say at every holiday? No, it's not a phrase from Hallel or a prayer. The 11 words are, they tried to kill us, they lost, we won, let's eat. On a more serious note, this image of Jews being saved at the last minute has become a theme in Jewish history. And for that simple reason, there are families and communities scattered throughout the Jewish world who, on various and different days, gather in celebration of their own private Purim holiday. These celebrations are variously called Purim Katan, Mini Purim, Second Purim, Private Purim, Family Purim, Community Purim, and even City Purim. A Megillah, a scroll describing the events of the special Purim, was written by each family or community. Every year, each community or family would fast the day before the big day, just like the fast of Esther on the day before Purim, and then gather to read their own Megillah, followed, of course, by feasting and celebration. The cities of Hebron, Tiberias in Israel, and Cairo in Egypt have two city community Purims, each 2 separate days when the Jews of their city were saved from being killed. In one case, let's say, in the case of Cairo, the Pasha, the ruler, had proclaimed that all the Jews would be executed after his bath. But during his bath, professional assassins came in and assassinated him. And so the Jews were saved. The most famous of all community Purims is the Vinz Purim. The Chatam Sofer, aka Rabbi Moses Sofer, was born in the German city of Frankfurt. 150 years before his birth, there was an uprising, a terrible uprising in Frankfurt Ghetto, known also as the Jewish Ghetto or the Fettmilch Ghetto. The local leader of Frankfurt was Vincent Fettmilch, sponsored the pogroms, raiding the Judengasse, the Jewish street, and even expelling the Jews. The Jews of Frankfurt were saved by Mattathias, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Can you imagine that? The emperor intervened, arrested Fettmilch and 6 of his henchmen, and executed them, not the Jews. The Jews were allowed to return to their ghetto homes, and the ensuing celebrations became known as the Vinz Purim, named after the notorious murder of the Jews, the name as reviled in Frankfurt as Haman was for the Jews of Persia during the Purim story, and for Jews throughout the history to this very day. The Chatam Sofer would return to Frankfurt each year for Vinz Purim, even after he became the chief rabbi of Pressburg. The message of Purim has not been lost on Jew haters. Adolf Hitler understood the message, and that is why he banned the holiday of Purim. Julius Streicher, the Nazi propagandist and the publisher of Der Stürmer, delivered a speech on November 10th, 1938, the day after Kristallnacht. In his speech, Streicher recalled that Jews butchered 75,000 Persians in one night, as written in the book of Esther. He then went on to say that the same fate would have befallen the German people had the Jews succeeded in inciting a war against Germany from the inside. The Jews, he said, quote, would have instituted a new Purim festival in Germany, unquote. That's powerful. Other historic Purim celebrations in Jewish history have occurred in Yemen, in Italy, in Vilna, and hundreds of other places by hundreds, if not thousands, of families. Today, unfortunately, most are no longer commemorated. So yes, Purim has deep significance in history, especially in the diaspora. One thing I can certainly tell you for certain, Purim is not about the costumes. Enjoy your Purim, Purim Sameach. Coming up next, Points of View. First up is a column from the Allgemeiner. This column was written by Iris Stoll, and it was published on February 16, 2023. The title is Prediction: Israeli Democracy Will Outlast Tom Friedman's New York Times Column. Stoll takes the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman to task for two of his recent columns about Israel. Columns in which Friedman hammered away at Israel and preached about democracy. Stoll's title may be biting, even jabbing, but it certainly encapsulates his essential point. Here's how Stoll begins. Tom Friedman usually cranks out opinion columns at the rate of about one a week. This week, he has gone into overdrive, publishing not one but two separate columns about Israeli judicial independence. Both columns display the double standards, lack of context, anonymous sources, and logical flaws that too often characterize New York Times coverage of Israel in general, and Friedman's columns in particular. The Times Online sub-headline on the first of the two columns has the Israeli Prime Minister's name misspelled as Netanyahu. It goes downhill from there. Stoll proceeds to give examples from the column that shows just how ridiculously out of bounds Friedman is. Stoll writes, the column reports on President Biden's weighing in on the debate over judicial reform in Israel. When Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke to Congress about the Iran nuclear deal, Friedman whined about it. The decision by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and House Speaker John Boehner to cook up an address to Congress by Netanyahu on why the U.S. should get tougher on Iran is churlish, reckless, and, for the future of Israeli-American relations, quite dangerous. Friedman called Netanyahu's speech an insult, claiming it doesn't only disrespect our president, it disrespects our system and certain diplomatic boundaries that every foreign leader should respect and usually has. Friedman advised, just lie low, Mr. Netanyahu. Don't play in our politics. Let America draw its own conclusions. Yet, when it comes to Israel's politics, Friedman throws respect for diplomatic boundaries to the wayside and solicits a statement from Biden that, as Friedman characterized it, weighed in on an internal Israeli debate. Got that? When Netanyahu weighs in on the Iran deal before Congress, it's dangerous and disrespectful. But when Biden weighs in on Israeli judicial reform, Friedman praises it as practically heroic. It will add credibility to America's voice in support of democracy globally, Friedman claimed. That is funny, because what Biden is doing is actually undercutting Israel's democratically elected government, which was elected by Israel's voters while promising to reform the judiciary. Only in Tom Friedman land is it in support of democracy when an American president tells a democratically elected prime minister not to do what the prime minister promised the voters he would do. Now Stoll points out that Friedman is just spewing anti-right ideas. Stoll explains that Friedman is not critiquing Israel so much as he is excoriating the right. Stoll writes, Friedman complains about what he calls an extremist right-wing think tank inspired by the Federalist Society in America. That's classic Times behavior, hurling insults, hurling adjectives, extremist, right-wing, rather than thoughtfully arguing the merits of an issue. If an Israeli civil society group had been inspired by the American Civil Liberties Union or the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, you can bet that the extremist left-wing columnist at the New York Times wouldn't mind one bit. Stoll now concludes by explaining that Thomas Friedman has always been predicting the end of Israel and the end of Israel's democracy. In Stoll's words, he writes, Tom Friedman has been predicting Israel's catastrophic collapse incorrectly since the 1970s, writing basically the same falsehood-riddled column after every major and minor news development in Israel. This time, he can't even get his source to speak to him on the record. The journalistic commercial incentives all tend toward Friedman hyping Netanyahu's proposal as the collapse of Israeli democracy. If Friedman is wrong, he can just write another column in a few months, making the same prediction. My prediction is that Israel's existence as a Jewish state and as a democracy will outlive the presence of Tom Friedman's columns on the New York Times opinion pages. That is a prediction I make in my own name, without hiding behind any anonymous sources. Wow, Ira Stoll has written a great piece. I've always admired and appreciated Tom Friedman, but this time he was way out of bounds. Next up is a column by Bruce Ticker. It was published on February 16th and appeared in the Boulder Jewish News. That's in Boulder, Colorado. The title is column, Questions on New York State Exam Revise Israeli History. Bruce Ticker writes about the recent New York State Regents exam administered to high school students, which used maps and asked several very problematic questions. He begins, Some critics might label 2 questions on the statewide test as intellectual dishonesty in our 4th largest state that is home to America's most sizable Jewish population, except that there was nothing intellectual about these questions. The correct multiple choice answer to one question assumes that the Holocaust most directly influenced Israel's partition plan developed by the United Nations in 1947. And the second correct answer assumes that Zionists and Jewish immigrants benefited most from the geographic outcome of the 1948 war for independence in which Arabs initiated. The standardized New York State test, which is a global history and geography state regents exam, abruptly sparked accusations of distortion of Israel's history from a group called Americans Against Anti-Semitism. Members of Congress from New York are calling on Governor Kathy Hochul and Education Commissioner Betty Rosa to investigate and hold those responsible to account. Disgusting is perhaps the best way to describe this action, with former State Assemblyman Dov Hikind explaining to the New York Post, the maps lack all context, specifically that border changes were the result of successive wars started by Arab states to annihilate Israel. Second, the questions at best lend themselves to debate, not to single answers from among false choices. Hikind, who leads Americans Against Anti-Semitism, was referring to 3 questionable maps linked to the 2 questions. The New York State Education Department assures of accuracy since these questions were, quote, designed to test students' knowledge of geography as it relates to historical events, unquote. No doubt something needs to be done about this. Hikind is taking action and organizing activities. He does very well. He does this stuff very, very well, and that's how Ticker continues. He writes, Hikind, along with Brooklyn Councilwoman Ina Vernikov and Americans Against Anti-Semitism, want Rosa, the State Commissioner of Education, to swiftly remove the disingenuous questions and conduct a thorough audit to ensure such egregious distortions of history that invariably lead to animosity for the sole Jewish state aren't being inadvertently fed to our children. Ticker now quotes from the publication called Jewish Insider. He writes, Jewish Insider reports that U.S. Representative Richie Torres, a New York City Democrat, wrote to the Board of Regents Chancellor Lester Young Jr., quote, I worry that these poorly contextualized maps will give the impression of having been drawn by boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement propagandists, play into the character assassination of Israel as an aggressor with ever-expanding borders, the settler colonialist caricature. Second, the exam reduces Israel to nothing more than a response to the Holocaust. The notion that the movement for Jewish self-determination has no raison d'etre outside the Holocaust is as offensive as it is ahistorical. People are clearly upset by this, especially if it's a trend. Ticker concludes his column this way. 9 Republican U.S. representatives from New York sent a letter to the governor and the education commissioner claiming that the exam, quote, blatantly promotes hateful anti-Jewish and anti-Israel rhetoric which only fans the flames of anti-Semitism in our schools, unquote. Up to now, we thought that the reports accusing Orthodox groups with abusing their yeshiva system and exploiting state financial support were shocking. Yet, if the 2 exam questions are New York's idea of secular education, who can blame the yeshiva management for being so defiant? A very problematic situation that certainly needs to be addressed in New York and possibly elsewhere. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 7 cartoons and memes today. The first 5 cartoons and memes are about the now hilarious balloons that have been dominating the news market. In this first cartoon, 5 famous flyers, Peter Pan, Mary Poppins, Dumbo, Superman, and Snoopy, are all looking at the front of a newspaper that reads, F-22s shoot down more UFOs. And Superman says, maybe we should call an Uber. Yes, indeed. Following a similar theme, on the cockpit of a fighter jet is the record of the pilot's successful downed objects. They are Mary Poppins, Peter Pan, Snoopy, a balloon. This is so hilarious. Even if you're not laughing out loud, I hope you're smiling looking at this cartoon. There's an interesting component to this story. People are truly fascinated by the balloon story. This cartoon particularly depicts a broadcaster saying, quote, okay, Russian collusion was a hoax, and Hunter Biden's laptop wasn't disinformation. We need to get back to giving people what they really want, UFOs. People are enthralled by UFOs, and now they are out of the closet and openly speaking about UFOs. I get questions about UFOs all the time now, and this is only since the balloon situation. Next up, we see a cartoon of a fighter pilot leaning out of his jet, opening his cockpit, and blowing a dart at the balloon. This is classic. The headlines are screaming with the big question, did we really shoot down a $12 balloon with a $440,000 missile? The final cartoon in the series makes fun of the entire alien UFO story. An alien is holding up a puppet of a U.S. military general, and he's standing behind the lectern emblazoned on it with the seal of the Defense Department. And the puppet says, aliens had no hand in recent aerial incidents. Of course, it's a hand of a puppet, which is making it even funnier. And it's the hand of an alien. This next one is very funny. It's a headline that reads, Ilhan Omar withdraws support from East Palestine after learning that it's in America. And finally, a Putin cartoon. Putin is playing poker. The poker table is a map of Ukraine, and Putin is gathering his many, many chips. Despite everything, there is no pressure that can be put upon Putin that will stop him at this moment. The only change that will happen is if it happens by way of internal changes in Russia. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Bloomberg News is predicting that international atomic monitors in Iran detected uranium enriched to levels just below that needed for nuclear weapons. Bloomberg cited 2 senior diplomats who confirmed that Iran is enriching uranium to levels far higher than permitted. According to the report, the International Atomic Energy Agency is trying to clarify how Iran accumulated uranium enriched to 84% purity, the highest level found by inspectors in the country to date, and the concentration just 6% below what is needed for a sophisticated nuclear weapon. Iran had previously told the IAEA that its centrifuges were configuring enriched uranium at 60% level of purity, not 84. This is deeply problematic. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that Iran was responsible for a reported attack on an Israeli-owned oil tanker last week. An attack on Liberian-flagged Campo Square was confirmed by the ship's captain, who said it was lightly damaged by an airborne object on February 10th while sailing through the Arabian Sea. Shipping databases linked the tanker to Zodiac Maritime, which is controlled by Israeli shipping magnate Eyal Ofer. Speaking at his weekly cabinet meeting, Netanyahu said, "Last week, Iran again attacked an oil tanker in the Persian Gulf and harmed the international freedom of navigation." North Korea announced that it had fired a Hwasong-15 intercontinental ballistic missile, that's called an ICBM, in a sudden launching drill. That confirmed its readiness to, quote, mobile and mighty counterattack against hostile forces. North Korea launched a long-range ballistic missile into the sea off Japan's west coast after giving warning of a strong response to upcoming military drills by South Korea and the United States. North Korea is flexing its muscles and is announcing to the world that they are prepared to strike back if necessary. A senior Israeli diplomat was removed from the African Union's annual summit in Ethiopia as a dispute over Israel's accreditation to the bloc escalated. Images posted online showed African Union security personnel confronting the Israeli diplomat during the opening ceremony of the summit before she left the auditorium. Israel's foreign ministry reacted with a statement that reads, "Israel looks harshly upon the incident in which the Deputy Director for Africa, Ambassador Sharon Bar-Lee, was removed from the African Union Hall despite her status as an accredited observer with entrance badges." The African Union defended their action, saying that only the Israeli ambassador to Ethiopia was credentialed to attend the event. Bar-Lee is the deputy director of the entire area. Very interesting. No less than 150,000 Israelis arrived over the weekend for the annual Darom Adom, or Red South Festival. The festival takes place throughout February and offers a wide variety of activities for the whole family, some free of charge, in the south of Israel. The greatest attraction is all the flowers that are brought in. More than 45,000 people have been killed in the earthquake that struck Turkey and Syria, and the toll is expected to soar even higher. About 264,000 homes in Turkey were destroyed, and many people are still missing in the country's worst modern disaster. Within 3 days, the death toll rose from 33,000 to 45,000. That's how great the numbers are. The death toll in Turkey stands at 39,672, while the neighboring Syrian death toll is 5,800. Syria's toll has not changed for days. On Friday, mosques around the world conducted absentee funerals for the dead in Turkey and Syria, many of whom could not receive full burial rites, given the enormity of the disaster. The missing will soon be assumed to be dead. The numbers will be shocking. Aftershocks are often even more devastating than the original quakes, and they are still being felt in the region. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that I spend a significant amount of time understanding critique? Thomas Friedman's critique of Israel is a classic example. I brought Ira Stoll's critique of Thomas Friedman's critique to explain critique. It is worthwhile spending some time on the idea of critique. In the past, we've spoken about tshuva, which also means repentance, but it's a form of critique also. The Hebrew refers to return, shuva, meaning coming back to, return to the original place. The idea is that, according to Maimonides, it's always about returning to the golden mean, to the central path, to the proper path. Critique is a slightly different idea. There are several terms in Hebrew, and Rabbinic Hebrew especially, for critique. The best term for our purpose is bikoret. A critic is a mevaker. Self-criticism is bikoret atzmi. An art, theater, movie, restaurant, book critic is also called a mevaker. The word for visit, to visit, is the same word, mevaker. There's an important linguistic link between criticizing and visiting. The concept is that the critic reviews, which means to view again, goes back to visit, again to further understand the subject. That is where Friedman and many others get it wrong. They are not criticizing for the sake of improving. Their critique is destructive, and then others feel justified too in their destructive criticism because of people like Thomas Friedman and their critique. Criticism for the sake of improvement is easily distinguished from destructive criticism. We know it immediately in our own lives. Most of it has to do with the tone with which it is offered. How one offers critique of Israel is the difference between being part of the solution and the future of a great experiment called the Jewish state, or wanting, wishing, or working for the destruction of Israel. It should be clear that if you believe that the problems of the Middle East will be solved, even in part, by Israel's destruction, then you are not in the camp that is working towards a just solution, and your critique is not in any constructive form. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.